How did signing those divorce papers land on my kitchen table before breakfast, after years of me laughing behind my husband's back with my friends? What happens when the person you thought you could control simply refuses to play along anymore? I never thought one night of support would end with my entire life exposed and judged. The wine had loosened everyone's tongues by the time we reached dessert. I looked around our cramped apartment dining room, watching my friends lean in closer as I painted Simon as the villain he'd become in my mind. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across their eager faces, all waiting for the next juicy detail about my supposedly terrible marriage. I mean, he just sits there with his laptop every night, I said, gesturing dramatically with my wine glass. When's the last time he actually talked to me about anything that wasn't Bill's or Hazel's school schedule? My sister Lila nodded sympathetically from across the table. That's not normal, Thalassa. A husband should be engaged with his wife's emotional needs. Simon's mother Martha shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but I ignored her disapproving look. She always took his side anyway. Exactly, I continued, feeling validated by Lila's support. And when I try to talk to him about it, he just shrugs and says he's tired from work. Like his IT consulting job is so much harder than what I do at the office. My friend Rebecca leaned forward conspiratorially. Have you thought about what you really want, Thalassa? Because life's too short to be miserable. From the kitchen came the sound of dishes clattering as Simon cleaned up alone. Again. But instead of feeling guilty, I felt vindicated. See? This is exactly what I was talking about. He never helps with anything social, I said, lowering my voice but making sure it was still loud enough for him to hear. I have to plan everything, invite everyone, cook everything. He just shows up and sits there like a bump on a log. 6-year-old Hazel had been unusually quiet during dinner, picking at her food and glancing nervously between the adults. Now she slipped down from her chair and headed toward the kitchen where her father was washing dishes. Maybe he's just not good with people, my mother Edith suggested, though her tone implied this was a serious character flaw. Some men are like that, emotionally unavailable. I seized on this. That's exactly it, Mom. He's emotionally unavailable. I feel like I'm married to a robot sometimes. Martha finally spoke up. Simon works very hard to provide for this family. He's always been a good father to Hazel and— Oh, Martha, please, I interrupted with a laugh. Just because he brings home a paycheck doesn't make him a good husband. There's more to marriage than just existing in the same house. The conversation continued to flow in my favor, with Lila and Rebecca chiming in with their own horror stories about emotionally distant men. I felt my phone buzz under the table and discreetly checked it. It was a text from Evan at work. Hope you're having a good evening. Thinking about you. My heart fluttered as I quickly typed back, wish you were here instead. I hit send before I could think better of it. When I looked up, Simon was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, his face unreadable. Hazel was beside him, holding his hand and looking anxious. Daddy says I can watch a movie before bed, Hazel announced quietly. That's fine, sweetie, I said, slipping my phone face down on the table. But just one movie. Simon's eyes lingered on my phone for a moment before he guided Hazel toward the living room. Something in his expression made me uncomfortable, but I pushed the feeling away. He was probably just sulking because he'd overheard us talking about him. See what I mean? I said to the table once he was gone. No conversation, no engagement. He just hovers around like a ghost in his own home. You deserve better than that, Rebecca said firmly. You're young and beautiful and fun. You shouldn't have to settle for someone who doesn't appreciate you. The validation felt like warm honey in my chest. This was exactly what I needed to hear. My friends understood me in a way Simon never had. I keep thinking about what my life could be like, I admitted, thinking of Evan's easy smile and the way he actually listened when I talked. What it would be like to be with someone who actually cares about my thoughts and feelings. There's nothing wrong with thinking about that, Leela said supportively. You can't help how you feel. Martha stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I think I should head home. Thank you for dinner, Thalassa. Her tone was cold, and I felt a flash of irritation. Of course she was taking Simon's side. She always did. Of course, Martha, thanks for coming, I said sweetly, though we both knew the politeness was forced. After she left, the conversation became even more animated. Without Simon's mother there to judge me, I felt free to really open up about my frustrations. The worst part is, I don't think he'd even care if I left, I said, finishing my third glass of wine. He'd probably be relieved. Then he could just work and watch TV without having to pretend to be interested in having a wife. If that's really how he feels, then you definitely deserve better, Rebecca said. Life's too short to waste on someone who doesn't value you. As the evening wound down and my friends prepared to leave, I felt more justified in my feelings than ever. They all agreed that Simon was the problem, that I was the victim in this marriage. Their support made me feel strong and righteous, but as I hugged everyone goodbye and closed the door behind them, I found Simon sitting on the couch with Hazel asleep against his shoulder. The movie was still playing softly, but he wasn't watching it. Instead, he was staring at nothing, his face troubled. She fell asleep halfway through, he said quietly, not looking at me. I'll put her to bed, I offered, but he shook his head. I've got it. He carefully lifted Hazel and carried her toward her bedroom. As he passed me in the hallway, he paused. Thalassa, we need to talk soon. About us. About everything. Something in his voice made my stomach clench, but I forced a casual tone. Sure, whatever you want to talk about. He studied my face for a long moment before continuing to Hazel's room. I heard him tucking her in, his voice soft as he whispered good night. When he came back to the living room, I was already cleaning up the wine glasses, trying to appear busy and unbothered. Your phone was buzzing during dinner, he said quietly. My hand froze on the stem of a wine glass. Oh, probably just work stuff. You know how it is. At 9 o'clock on a Friday night? Evan's working late on a project. Sometimes he needs to check things with me. The lie came easily, which should have worried me more than it did. Simon nodded slowly, but his expression remained troubled. I see. We finished cleaning in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. As we got ready for bed, I caught him watching me in the bathroom mirror, his reflection serious and sad. Simon, is everything okay? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. I love you, Thalassa. I love our family. I hope you know that. The unexpected vulnerability in his voice made me uncomfortable. It was easier when he was distant and distracted. This version of Simon, raw and honest, made me feel guilty about things I wasn't ready to feel guilty about. I know, I said, though the words felt hollow. I love you too. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Simon slept beside me, I wondered if that was still true. And more unsettling, I wondered if he was starting to suspect it wasn't. The bistro was packed for a Friday night, but Rebecca had managed to snag us a corner table where we could talk freely. The dim lighting and buzz of conversation made it feel intimate and safe, like a confessional where I could air all my grievances without judgment. So how are things at home after last week? Lila asked, sliding into the booth beside me. You seemed pretty frustrated during dinner. I took a long sip of my Cosmopolitan before answering. Worse, if anything. Simon's been even more withdrawn lately. I think he's sulking because he overheard us talking about him. Well, maybe he needed to hear it, Rebecca said firmly. Sometimes men don't realize how their behavior affects their wives until someone points it out. That's just it, though. I don't think he cares how it affects me, I said, feeling the familiar surge of resentment. He's perfectly happy living like roommates. No real conversation, no intimacy, no emotional connection. It's like being married to a stranger. My friend Jennifer nodded sympathetically. That sounds incredibly lonely, Thalassa. No woman should have to live like that. The validation felt good, encouraging me to continue. And the worst part is, I know what it's like to have someone actually pay attention to me. There's this guy at work, Evan, and when he talks to me, he actually listens. He asks about my day, remembers things I've told him, makes me feel like what I have to say matters. That's how a man should treat you, Lila said supportively. That's basic respect. I felt emboldened by their agreement. Exactly. And it's not like I'm asking for the moon here. I just want to feel valued and appreciated. But Simon acts like I'm just another piece of furniture in the house. Have you tried talking to him about it directly? Jennifer asked. I laughed bitterly. You can't talk to someone who doesn't want to listen. Every time I try to bring up our relationship, he either changes the subject or says he's too tired to deal with it. It's like he's given up on us completely. Maybe he has, Rebecca said bluntly. And if that's the case, you need to think about what you want to do about it. The suggestion hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility. What did I want to do about it? I keep thinking about what it would be like to be free, I admitted, the wine making me bolder than usual. To be with someone who actually wants to be with me, not just someone who tolerates my presence. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be happy, my mother Edith said. She'd joined us halfway through the evening, having finished her own dinner plans early. Life's too short to settle for less than you deserve. But what about Hazel? Jennifer asked practically. Divorce is hard on kids. Kids are resilient, Edith said firmly, and it's better for her to see her mother happy than to grow up thinking a loveless marriage is normal. I felt a pang of guilt at the mention of Hazel, but pushed it aside. My daughter deserved a mother who was fulfilled and happy, didn't she? How could I be a good parent if I was miserable in my marriage? Besides, I continued, Simon's so checked out that I don't think he'd even fight for custody. He'd probably be relieved to have less responsibility. Is he a good father, at least? Rebecca asked. I considered this. He's adequate. He helps with homework and reads bedtime stories, but there's no real emotional connection there either. Hazel's always been more attached to me anyway. This wasn't entirely true. Hazel adored her father and often sought him out for comfort. But it felt true in the moment, surrounded by supportive friends who agreed with everything I said. You know what you need? Lila said conspiratorially. You need to start thinking about yourself for once. Stop trying to fix a marriage that Simon clearly doesn't want to work on. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, I admitted, especially since Evan and I have been spending more time together at work. He makes me remember what it feels like to be desired, you know? The table went quiet for a moment, the implication hanging heavy in the air. Are you two? Rebecca started, then trailed off. We're just friends, I said quickly, though my cheeks burned. But he treats me better as a friend than Simon treats me as a wife. That says something, doesn't it? It says everything, Edith said firmly. You deserve a man who makes you feel special, not one who takes you for granted. As the evening progressed, I found myself painting an increasingly dark picture of my marriage. Every small annoyance became evidence of Simon's neglect, every moment of distance proof of his indifference. My friends hung on every word, offering sympathy and encouragement in equal measure. The thing is, I said, leaning forward conspiratorially, I don't even think Simon would notice if I had an affair. He's that disconnected from our relationship. Maybe that's his way of giving you permission, Rebecca suggested with a wicked smile. We all laughed at that, but underneath the humor was a serious suggestion. If Simon wasn't fulfilling his duties as a husband, didn't that free me from my obligations as a wife? You only get one life, Thalassa, Jennifer said seriously. Don't waste it on someone who doesn't appreciate what he has. As we prepared to leave, I felt more justified in my feelings than ever. My friends, people who cared about me and wanted me to be happy, all agreed that Simon was the problem. They understood what I was going through in a way he never could. But as I walked to my car, I noticed a familiar figure at the bar inside the restaurant. Nathan, Simon's brother, was nursing a beer and checking his phone. Had he been there the whole time? Had he overheard our conversation? My stomach clenched with anxiety, but I forced myself to walk normally to my car. Even if Nathan had heard something, what could he really do? I was just talking to my friends about my marriage problems. There was nothing wrong with that. Still, as I drove home, I felt uneasy. The support and validation from my friends had felt so good in the moment, but now, alone in my car, doubts began to creep in. When I got home, Simon was reading in bed, his laptop closed on the nightstand. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable. "How was girls' night?" he asked quietly. "Fine, just the usual gossip and complaining," I said, trying to sound casual as I got ready for bed. "Nathan texted me earlier," Simon said, still watching me carefully. "Said he saw you at the bistro. Sounded like you were having an intense conversation." My blood ran cold, but I forced a laugh. "You know how we get when we're together. Everything feels more dramatic than it really is." Simon nodded slowly, but something in his eyes had changed. There was a wariness there that hadn't been present before, a guardedness that made me nervous. "Thalassa," he said carefully, "if there's something you want to talk about us, about our marriage, I'm here. I know I haven't been the best husband lately, but I want to try to fix things if you do." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the love I'd once had for him, a memory of why I'd married him in the first place. But then I thought about Evan's easy smile, about how alive I felt when I was with him, about how my friends had validated all my feelings about Simon's shortcomings. "I'm fine, Simon. We're fine," I said, turning away to brush my teeth. "You don't need to fix anything." In the bathroom mirror, I saw him nod and return to his book, but the tension in his shoulders told a different story. He knew something was wrong, even if he couldn't put his finger on what. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Simon's steady breathing beside me, I felt the weight of secrets growing heavier. But instead of making me want to confess, it made me more determined to protect what I'd found with Evan. After all, my friends were right. I deserved to be happy. Monday morning at the office felt different somehow, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. I'd spent the weekend thinking about my friends' words, about their encouragement to pursue my own happiness. When Evan smiled at me from across the break room, my heart raced in a way it hadn't in years. "Good weekend?" he asked, moving closer as I poured my coffee. "It was okay," I said, hyper-aware of his proximity. "Spent some time with friends, did some thinking." "Thinking about what?" His voice was low, intimate, and I felt that familiar flutter in my chest. "About what I really want," I said, meeting his eyes directly. The break room was empty except for us, the early morning quiet broken only by the hum of the coffee machine. Evan stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne. "And what do you want, Thalassa?" Before I could answer, our co-worker Janet walked in, chattering loudly on her phone. The spell was broken, but the tension remained, crackling between us like electricity. Throughout the day, I found excuses to visit Evan's department. A question about a project timeline, a clarification on a client request. Each interaction felt loaded with meaning, with the promise of something more. "We should grab lunch," he suggested during one of these visits. "Talk about the Morrison account." We both knew the Morrison account didn't require a lunch meeting, but I agreed anyway. The restaurant he chose was across town, far from our office and the possibility of running into co-workers. As we settled into a corner booth, I felt like I was crossing a line I'd been approaching for weeks. "So, tell me about this thinking you've been doing," Evan said once we'd ordered. I found myself opening up about my marriage in ways I never had before, painting Simon as even more neglectful and emotionally absent than I had with my friends. With Evan, I felt safe to exaggerate, to make myself seem more like a victim than I really was. "He barely acknowledges I exist," I said, leaning forward across the table. "I could disappear tomorrow and I don't think he'd notice for weeks." "That's impossible," Evan said, his hand reaching across to cover mine. "You're impossible to ignore." The touch sent electricity through my entire body. When was the last time Simon had reached for my hand? When was the last time he'd looked at me the way Evan was looking at me now? Sometimes I feel like I'm invisible in my own home, I continued, not pulling my hand away. Like I'm just going through the motions of being a wife without any of the actual connection that should come with it. You deserve so much better than that, Evan said, his thumb stroking across my knuckles. You're beautiful and intelligent and funny. Any man would be lucky to have your attention. The words were like a balm to my wounded ego. This was what I'd been missing, this feeling of being seen and valued and desired. I keep thinking about what it would be like, I said quietly, to be with someone who actually wants me. You don't have to just think about it, Evan said, his voice low and intense. You could experience it. The suggestion hung between us, loaded with possibility and danger. I knew I should pull my hand away, should make an excuse and leave, should remember my marriage vows and my daughter waiting at home. Instead, I squeezed his hand and said, I'd like that. The rest of lunch passed in a blur of meaningful looks and careful touches. By the time we returned to the office, we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. My apartment is empty tonight, Evan said quietly as we stood by the elevator. If you want to continue this conversation. I thought about Simon, probably already home from his own job, helping Hazel with her homework while he waited for me to return. I thought about the dinner I should be cooking, the family time I should be prioritizing. But then I thought about my friend's words, about deserving happiness, about not wasting my life on someone who didn't appreciate me. I'll have to work late tonight, I said. A big project came up. Evan smiled, understanding perfectly. I'll be working late too. The afternoon dragged by slowly, every minute feeling like an hour. I called Simon around 4 to let him know about my fictional work emergency. That's fine, he said, though I could hear the disappointment in his voice. I'll pick up Hazel and handle dinner. Will you be very late? Probably, I said, guilt twisting in my stomach. Don't wait up. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Okay, be safe driving home. The concern in his voice made me feel worse, but I pushed the feeling aside. He was probably relieved to have an evening without me anyway. At 6 o'clock, when the office had mostly emptied out, Evan appeared at my desk. Ready to go? He asked quietly. I gathered my things with shaking hands, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. This was really happening. I was really doing this. Evan's apartment was everything Simon's and mine wasn't. Sleek, modern, uncluttered. No toys scattered across the floor, no family photos on the walls, no evidence of the complicated messiness of real life. Wine, he offered, and I accepted gratefully, needing something to calm my nerves. We sat on his expensive leather couch, close but not quite touching, the weight of what we were about to do hanging heavy in the air. Are you sure about this? He asked, his hand moving to rest on my knee. I thought about Simon again, about his quiet disappointment when I'd called, about the way he'd offered to handle everything at home without complaint. For a moment, doubt flickered through me, but then Evan leaned closer, his lips brushing against my ear as he whispered, You're so beautiful. I've wanted this for so long. And all my doubts melted away, replaced by the intoxicating feeling of being desired, of being the center of someone's attention in a way I hadn't felt in years. What happened next felt inevitable, like we'd been building toward this moment for months. In Evan's arms, I felt alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. He made me feel beautiful and wanted and special. Everything Simon had stopped making me feel. Afterward, as we lay tangled together on his couch, I felt a mixture of exhilaration and guilt that I wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. This doesn't have to be complicated, Evan said, his fingers tracing patterns on my bare shoulder. We're both adults. We both know what this is. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what this was. All I knew was that I didn't want it to end. When I finally made it home at nearly 11 o'clock, Simon was still awake, reading in bed. He looked up when I entered, his expression concerned. Long day? He asked quietly. Exhausting, I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. I'm going to shower and go straight to bed. There's leftover dinner in the fridge if you're hungry, he offered. I grabbed something at the office, I lied, avoiding his eyes as I gathered my pajamas. In the shower, I scrubbed away the evidence of my betrayal, watching the water swirl down the drain and wishing my guilt could disappear as easily. But even as I felt bad about what I'd done, I couldn't bring myself to regret it completely. For the first time in years, I felt alive. When I emerged from the bathroom, Simon was still awake, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Thalassa," he said carefully, "is everything okay? You seem different lately." My heart pounded, but I forced a casual tone. "Just stressed about work. You know how it gets." He nodded, but his eyes remained troubled. "If there's anything you want to talk about, I'm here. You know that, right?" "Of course," I said, sliding into bed beside him. "Everything's fine, Simon. You worry too much." But as I lay there in the dark, listening to his breathing gradually slow into sleep, I wondered if everything was fine. And more troubling, I wondered if I cared. The family gathering at Martha's house had been planned for weeks, but as I sat in her pristine living room, surrounded by Simon's relatives, I felt like I was walking into enemy territory. Martha had been cold to me since that dinner party, and I suspected she'd been poisoning the family against me. "Thalassa, you look tired," Martha observed as she served coffee, her tone suggesting this wasn't entirely a compliment. "Are you getting enough rest?" "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Work's been keeping me busy lately. Lots of late nights." Simon's brother Nathan exchanged a look with his wife that I didn't like. Had they been talking about me? About what Nathan might have overheard at the bistro? "It must be difficult balancing work and family," Martha continued, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Hazel mentioned you haven't been home for bedtime much lately." My daughter looked up from her coloring book, her expression innocent but her words cutting. "Daddy reads me stories now. He does the funny voices better anyway." A few of Simon's cousins chuckled, but I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Was my own daughter turning against me too? "I'm sure Mummy's doing important work," Simon said quietly, though his tone lacked conviction. "Oh, I'm sure it's very important," Martha said, and something in her emphasis made my stomach clench. "What kind of projects keep you so busy, dear?" I felt trapped, surrounded by hostile faces all waiting for me to slip up. The coffee cup in my hands felt hot enough to burn, but not as hot as the anger building in my chest. "You know, Martha, not all of us have the luxury of sitting at home judging other people's choices," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Some of us have to work for a living." The room went quiet, the tension thick enough to cut. Martha's eyes flashed with anger, but her voice remained controlled. "I'm not judging anyone, dear. I'm simply concerned about my granddaughter, who seems confused about why her mother is never home anymore." "I am home," I protested, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't really true. Between my actual work, my extended lunches with Evan, and our after-hours meetings at his apartment, I'd been absent more often than not lately. "Are you?" Nathan asked quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made me nervous. "Because from what I've observed, you seem to have other priorities these days." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. I looked around the room at Simon's family, all watching me with varying degrees of suspicion and disappointment, and felt my carefully constructed justifications crumble. "What exactly are you trying to say?" I demanded, standing up abruptly. "If you have something to accuse me of, just say it." "Nobody's accusing you of anything," Simon said, but his voice was strained. "Let's just calm down and—" "No, let's not calm down," I interrupted, the weeks of guilt and defensiveness finally boiling over. "I'm tired of being treated like the villain here. You all act like I'm some terrible wife and mother. But where's Simon in all this? When's the last time he planned a date night or showed any interest in our marriage?" The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs, but I was too angry to stop. "You want to know why I'm working late? Because at least at work people appreciate me. At least there." I feel like I matter to someone. Thalassa, Simon said quietly, his face pale. Please don't do this here. But I was past caring about appearances or family harmony. All the resentment I'd been building up for months came pouring out. You all sit here judging me, but none of you see how lonely I am in my own marriage. Simon treats me like a roommate, not a wife. He's more interested in his computer than in his family. That's not true, Martha said firmly. Simon works hard to provide for you and Hazel. He's a good man and a devoted father. Providing money isn't the same as being a husband, I shot back. When's the last time he told me I was beautiful? When's the last time he seemed genuinely interested in spending time with me? I was dimly aware that Hazel had stopped coloring and was watching the adults with wide, frightened eyes, but I couldn't stop myself. You know what? Maybe I have been spending time with someone who actually appreciates me. Maybe I have found someone who makes me feel valued and desired. And maybe that's exactly what I deserve after years of being taken for granted. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could see the shock and disappointment on every face in the room. Simon stood slowly, his movements careful and controlled. I think we should go home now, he said quietly. No, let's not go home and pretend everything's fine, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Let's talk about how you've checked out of our marriage. Let's talk about how you make me feel invisible in my own home. Thalassa, please, Simon said, glancing meaningfully at Hazel. Not here, not like this. But I was beyond reason, beyond caring about the consequences of my words. At least Evan listens when I talk. At least he makes me feel like I'm worth his time and attention. The name slipped out before I could catch it, and I saw Simon's face go white. Around the room, his family members exchanged horrified looks. Who's Evan? Little Hazel asked in a small voice. The question hit me like a slap, bringing me back to reality. I looked down at my daughter's confused face and felt the first real wave of shame wash over me. Nobody, sweetheart, Simon said gently, kneeling down to her level. Just someone Mommy works with. But the damage was done. Everyone in the room now knew that I was having an affair, and worse, I'd announced it in front of my 6-year-old daughter. Martha stood up slowly, her face cold with anger. I think you should leave now, Thalassa, and I think you should think very carefully about what kind of mother and wife you want to be. Don't you dare lecture me about... I started, but Simon cut me off. We're leaving, he said firmly, scooping Hazel up in his arms. Say goodbye to Grandma, sweetheart. As we gathered our things and headed for the door, I could feel the weight of everyone's judgment pressing down on me. But instead of feeling ashamed, I felt angry and defensive. You're all hypocrites, I said as we reached the door. You act like I'm some monster, but none of you care about what I need or how I feel. You only care about protecting Simon. We care about protecting our family, Martha said coldly, including that little girl who doesn't deserve to be hurt by her mother's selfish choices. The drive home was silent except for Hazel's quiet sniffling in the back seat. Simon's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were white, but he didn't say a word. It wasn't until we were home, and Hazel was in bed, that Simon finally spoke. We need to talk, he said, his voice deadly calm. But first, I have some things I need to take care of. What kind of things? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Important things, he said, grabbing his car keys. I'll be back later tonight. Where are you going? He paused at the door, looking back at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, determined, and utterly without love. To protect my daughter, he said simply, and then he was gone. I stood in our empty living room, the silence oppressive after the chaos of the evening. For the first time since this whole thing started, I began to wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. But it was too late for wondering now. Simon didn't come home until after midnight. I'd been pacing the living room for hours, alternating between anger and anxiety, rehearsing the arguments I would make when he returned. By the time I heard his key in the lock, I'd convinced myself that I was the wronged party in all this. "Where have you been?" I demanded as he walked through the door. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Taking care of some business." "What kind of business?" "It's after midnight, Simon." "The kind of business that became necessary after tonight's performance," he said calmly, setting a manila folder on the coffee table. Something about his tone made my stomach clench with unease. This wasn't the hurt, confused Simon I'd expected to face. This was someone else entirely, someone cold and controlled and dangerous. "Look, I know tonight got out of hand," I said, trying to regain the upper hand. "But you have to understand how frustrated I've been. You can't just ignore the problems in our marriage and expect me to—" "Sit down, Thalassa." The command in his voice was so unexpected that I found myself obeying before I could think better of it. Simon remained standing, looking down at me with those same cold eyes. "I want you to tell me about Evan." "There's nothing to tell," I said automatically. "He's just a co-worker. I was upset and I said things I didn't mean." "Try again." The simple words carried such weight that I felt my carefully constructed lies beginning to crumble. But I couldn't give up now. Too much was at stake. "I don't know what you want me to say, Simon. Yes, I've been talking to Evan about our marriage problems. Yes, he's been supportive when you haven't been, but that doesn't mean— How long have you been sleeping with him?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to deny it, to act outraged at the accusation, but something in Simon's expression stopped me. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said weakly. Simon picked up the manila folder and opened it, pulling out a stack of papers. "These are your work timesheets for the past 2 months," he said, his voice clinical and detached. "According to your employer, you've been leaving early or taking extended lunches at least 3 times a week." My mouth went dry. "I've been working from different locations. Sometimes Evan and I meet at coffee shops too." "These," Simon continued, pulling out more papers, "are the security logs from your office building. They show exactly when you badge in and out. Would you like to guess how many of your supposed late nights actually involved you being at the office?" I stared at the papers in his hands, my mind racing. How had he gotten access to this information? How long had he been investigating me? "You've been busy tonight," I said, trying to sound defiant rather than terrified. "I've been busy for weeks," Simon replied calmly. "Ever since Nathan told me what he overheard at the bistro. Ever since I started paying attention to the lies." He pulled out his phone and began reading from the screen. "March 15th, working late on the Morrison account. Security logs show you left the building at 2:30 p.m. March 22nd, emergency meeting with a client. You never returned to the office after lunch." Each date hit me like a hammer blow. I'd been so careful, so sure that Simon was too distracted to notice my absences. But he'd been watching, documenting, building a case against me. "And then there are these," he said, pulling out a stack of printed text messages. My blood turned to ice. Those were my messages with Evan. Intimate, explicit, damning messages that left no doubt about the nature of our relationship. "How did you get those?" I whispered. "You left your phone unlocked last Tuesday night. I took the liberty of forwarding myself some interesting conversations." I felt like I was drowning, like the walls were closing in around me. All my careful lies, all my justifications, all my righteous anger, none of it mattered in the face of this evidence. "Simon, please," I said, my voice breaking. "Let me explain. It's not what you think. I was lonely and confused and—" "It's exactly what I think," he said, his voice still eerily calm. "You've been having an affair for 2 months. You've been lying to me, to our daughter, to our families. You've been using our marriage as a cover while you played house with another man." "That's not fair," I protested, desperation making me defensive. "You're making it sound so calculated, but it wasn't like that. I was hurting, Simon. I felt invisible in our marriage. I needed someone to see me, to value me." "So you decided to betray our wedding vows instead of talking to me about it." "I tried to talk to you. You never wanted to listen. You were always too busy or too tired or too distracted." Simon was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. You know what's interesting, Thalassa? I've been going through our conversations over the past few months, trying to figure out when you actually tried to talk to me about our problems. Do you know what I found? I didn't answer, afraid of what he might say. Nothing. Not one serious conversation about our marriage. Not one attempt to work on our issues together. Instead, you talk to your friends about what a terrible husband I am. You talk to your sister about how unhappy you are. You talk to Evan about how neglected you feel. But you never talk to me. The accusation stung because it was true. I'd complained about Simon to everyone except Simon himself. You wouldn't have listened anyway, I said weakly. You didn't give me the chance. He sat down across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Do you know what I've been doing for the past 3 months, Thalassa? I've been trying to figure out how to save our marriage. I've been reading books about communication and intimacy. I've been planning date nights that you kept cancelling because of work emergencies that didn't exist. I felt tears starting to form, but I couldn't tell if they were from guilt or self-pity. I made mistakes too, Simon continued. I know I've been distant lately. I know I haven't been the husband you needed, but I was willing to work on it. I was willing to fight for us. We can still work on it, I said desperately. We can go to counselling. I'll end things with Evan. We can start over. Simon shook his head slowly. No, we can't. Why not? People get through affairs all the time. We can rebuild the trust. Because you're not sorry, he said simply. You're sorry you got caught, but you're not sorry you did it. Even now, you're trying to justify it by blaming me for not being a good enough husband. The truth of his words hit me like a slap. He was right, I wasn't sorry. Even sitting there, faced with the evidence of my betrayal, part of me still felt justified in what I'd done. I love you, Simon, I said, though the words felt hollow even to me. No, you don't, he replied sadly. You love the idea of me, the security I provide, the life we've built together. But you don't love me enough to be faithful to me. You don't love me enough to work on our problems instead of running to another man. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of our failed marriage settling between us like a physical presence. What happens now? I asked finally. Simon stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. Now you pack a bag and stay somewhere else tonight. Tomorrow you'll hear from my lawyer. You can't just throw me out of my own home, I protested. I'm not throwing you out. I'm asking you to leave voluntarily for Hazel's sake. She doesn't need to see any more of this ugliness. You can't keep me from my daughter. I'm not keeping you from her, but I am going to make sure she's protected from the chaos you've created. The finality in his voice terrified me. This wasn't the Simon I'd married, the gentle man who avoided conflict and let me have my way to keep the peace. This was someone harder, someone who'd been pushed too far and was finally pushing back. Simon, please, I tried one more time. We can fix this. I know we can. He turned back to me, and for a moment I saw a flash of the old Simon, hurt and vulnerable and still loving me despite everything. But then his expression hardened again. You already fixed it, Thalassa. You found someone who makes you happy. I hope it was worth it. As I packed a bag with shaking hands, I could hear Simon on the phone in the living room, his voice low and controlled as he spoke to someone. Probably his lawyer, probably already setting the wheels of divorce in motion. I thought about Evan, about whether he'd want me to stay at his place now that everything was out in the open. But something told me that the fantasy we'd been living was about to collide hard with reality. As I walked out of the house that had been my home for 6 years, I felt like I was walking out of my entire life. Behind me, Simon stood in the doorway, watching me go with those same cold, disappointed eyes. Goodbye, Thalassa, he said quietly. And somehow I knew he meant it. The law office felt like a sterile trap, glass walls, chrome edges, furniture too expensive for someone like me. I sat opposite Simon and his sharp-eyed lawyer, my own rushed attorney fidgeting beside me as the mediator outlined the wreckage of my life. 3 weeks earlier, Simon had discovered the affair. By morning, divorce papers were filed, primary custody of Hazel requested, every betrayal documented in that thick folder now glaring from the table. Supervised visitation, Simon's lawyer said coolly. Your client's instability, exposed conversations, absent nights, continued contact with the affair partner, raises serious concerns. I protested weakly. She's my daughter. I never hurt her. Simon finally spoke, voice low and final. You hurt all of us. Hazel needs stability, not excuses. The mediator pushed forward. Primary custody to Simon, supervised visits twice weekly, psychological evaluation required. Evidence of my lies, my choices, lay open like an autopsy. I looked at Simon, once gentle, now resolute, and felt the truth sink in. I'd chased excitement with Evan, only for him to vanish when consequences arrived. Now the fantasy was ashes. I want my family back, I whispered, tears falling. That's not possible, Simon said. You chose, multiple times. I signed where they pointed. The house stayed his. I got a modest settlement and a long road of supervised visits. 6 months later, in my small apartment, I prepared for another 2-hour slot with Hazel. Counseling helped. Evaluations cleared me for more time soon. But the daily laughter, bedtime stories, the simple weight of her in my arms, those were gone. I'd traded a steady love for fleeting validation. Simon was right. Actions have consequences, and some losses